A unique constraint ensures that no duplicates are allowed in the referenced column. Well, that sounds very similar to what a primary key does, but not exactly. There are differences why you might use a unique constraint versus a primary key constraint. A unique constraint is used when you don't want duplicate values in the column for that table, but you do want to allow null values, and maybe it's a value that can be changed. Okay, and again, I think we discussed this in class, an example of a student's username or email address, or an employee's username or email address. You don't want them to be duplicated, but you don't want them to be the primary key value either, because it's something that might change, and your primary key value is something that you do not want to change ever, if possible. Okay, a check constraint is used to update, updates and additions must meet specified conditions. So, conditions, are established. Again, this goes back to those business rules and policies. Conditions are established that the data entered into this particular field must meet. And on page 113 has an example of an alter table statement where a check constraint is added on the ship date field. Okay? And the check constraint in this example is a mathematical expression. Okay? Remember, we can do some simple math like adding and subtracting to date data types. So what this check constraint is saying is that the ship date must be, they've got it kind of backwards here, but it works either way. The ship date must be greater than or equal to the order date. In other words, you can't ship something before it's ordered. I'm going to try to get rid of some of the confusion that I might just have caused before that. The constraint, the check constraint, is ensuring that the order date, so it must be ordered before or on the same date as the ship date. Okay. But again, ultimately, you can't ship it before it's ordered. Right, not null constraints. This is a check constraint, but it's a special check constraint. It's a constraint that ensures that a value must be entered for this particular field. The not null constraint is a special check constraint with the is not null condition. This might be an example where you want to provide a default value for a field. Okay, possibly. If the user does not, if the database user, if the data entry person does not provide a value for the field, and the field does have a not null constraint, then the default value would automatically be entered to avoid an error in the record insertion or in the data entry process. This is one of those examples of when you're setting up your system that you provide some user friendliness for the person doing the data entry. As mentioned earlier, the not null constraint can only be created at the column level. When you use the describe command, if we go back to a previous chapter, I think it was chapter 2, when we discussed the describe command, the output of the describe command includes whether or not the fields or the columns are not null or have not null constraints assigned to them. not null constraint can only be added to an existing table using the altered table statement with the modify clause. You can't add a not null constraint to an existing table. You have to modify an existing column to create the not null constraint for an existing table. Page 115 has an example. You can include constraints during table creation at the column level. Page 119 gives an example, and again, this is a create table statement. So in our column definition, here's the column name, the data type and width, the keyword constraint, the name of the constraint that you provide, and the type of the constraint. The next field or column that we define, the name, the data type and length, not null indicates that it is a not null constraint. But we're also going to add a second constraint on this field or column. So we use the constraint keyword, the name of this constraint, and then what type of constraint it is. Unique. Okay. Now this might be a little bit confusing. You say that, or this statement is saying that the field cannot be not null. Okay. So the user must enter data into this field. But the data that they enter must be unique. A moment ago I suggested that if it has a not null constraint you might want to put in a default value. Well, here's an example where you would not want to put in a default value, because if you put in a default value, that could possibly attempt to give two departments the same name. And of course, now that we have the unique constraint, that would result in an error. So again, this is an example where the business rules or policies is that we do not want to have departments with identical names.